Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Late Sub Podcast. I am your host, Claire Watkins. I say this every week, but boy, do we have a show for you. We have 2 rounds of the NCAA Women's Basketball Tournament. We have a new U.S. Women's National Team roster to discuss and a full match weekend slate of NWSL games to analyze which teams are flying, which teams we're a little bit worried about in the early days. I'm not going to mess around. Let's get right into it. We got a lot to talk about. All right, we have made it through the first 2 rounds of March Madness. A lot of basketball over the last 4 days. Gotta tell you guys, my eyes are a little bit blurry. My brain is a little fried. It's been all ball all the time, which of course is amazing and also a little bit hard on the brain. However, amazing first 2 rounds. We didn't quite maybe get as much quote unquote madness as we were hoping for or expecting. There were only actually 4 upsets in seed, only 4 seeded upsets over the entire first 2 rounds of the NCAA Women's Basketball Tournament. The 2 biggest ones that you guys might have heard about were number 11 Middle Tennessee took down number 6 Louisville in the first round, and number 7 Duke took my beloved Buckeyes down. Ohio State number 2 in the second round. Possibly not entirely shocking for people who had been paying attention. The Buckeyes did not have momentum on their side going into the NCAA tournament. But the other 2 were just real close seeds. Number 5 Colorado over number 4 Kansas State. Number 5 Baylor over number 4 Virginia Tech. So a lot of chalk. So we're going to be talking about a lot of the same teams this week as we were last week because we did not lose that many top seeds. Again, rest in peace to the Buckeyes. Good luck next year. So let's talk about the teams that have advanced into the Sweet 16. All 4 number 1 seeds are through. That's South Carolina, Iowa, Texas, and USC. 3 number 2 seeds are through: Notre Dame, UCLA, and Stanford. All 4 number 3 seeds are through: Oregon State, LSU, UConn, and NC State. 2 number 4 seeds, Gonzaga and Indiana. 2 number 5 seeds, Baylor and Colorado. And of course, the great standing Duke Blue Devils. They are the ones taking over the underdog role here at the number 7 spot. So I'm going to say this probably 16 times in this episode. We're not going to get too granular. We're not going to go game by game. As fun as that would be and as exciting as many of these games are, there's just too much to get into. So I think we're just going to sort of talk teams, talk sort of team impressions, team mentality, what we're seeing from some of these top seeds going into neutral courts, going into the Sweet 16, where things really start to get real. Because while a lot of these top seeds kind of pulled out these wins, I think some teams have looked really convincing and some teams have not. Now that can shift. You move off of neutral court, you move away from maybe the pressures, the highs and lows of being in front of a home crowd, and perhaps things actually get easier. You can get into a little bit more of a routine. But we definitely saw some teams feel that boost from being at home, and we saw some teams maybe feel the pressure of being at home. And it's fascinating to see how that's going to manifest as we go into these later rounds. So I think the obvious first team to say, super impressive, South Carolina. It's crazy. They're undefeated, right? I keep saying this. I'm like, they're the undefeated team. No one's beaten them. And yet now it seems like they're playing their best basketball. They have hit that arc of peaking at the right time, despite not dropping a single game so far this season. They've wiped the court with their first 2 opponents, and they looked like they were having fun. Whatever kind of stress they were feeling out of the SEC tournament is gone. A really good example, if we want to take kind of like one micro example from the first 2 rounds for South Carolina that I hope encapsulates sort of what Dawn Staley makes look so easy and why this team is actually playing better now than they were at the beginning of the season. If you look at the box scores, you'll see that Malaysia Fulwiley, the freshman, is playing incredibly well right now. Now, she was already playing really, really well in the SEC tournament. She's coming into her own. She's getting used to the college game. She was already sort of had this blistering talent, but she's adding more elements to her game as she's rising to the level of competition. There was a really nice full circle moment in the second round for South Carolina where they were playing North Carolina. They were playing UNC, which was a team that they had played prior in the season. Now, that game originally back in November was pretty close. I think that was a single-digit win for the Gamecocks. So that's one of those wins that maybe you've heard me talk about before where you say that could have gone either way. It's a learning experience while also being a W. Now, Malaysia Fulwiley does not play in that game in November because she was benched by Dawn Staley. Because Dawn Staley wanted to see more defense out of Fulwiley. She wanted to see more attention to detail. She wanted to see some of those tiny little things, those tiny little like gritty pieces of work that you have to put into your game in college, that you have to add to your game in college. It's not all just going to be breakaway layups. Fulwiley responds, plays really, really well in the second half of the season. And if you saw Full Wiley on, she was marking Deja Kelly when she was on the floor, which is UNC's best player. She was getting turnovers, she was getting tip balls, she was getting steals, she was turning those steals into breakaway buckets. She was creating offense from her own defense. And that is a different player even that we saw at the beginning of the season. And when people kind of say that Dawn Staley is overlooked at times, I do think that in the grand scheme, I don't know if that's entirely true because obviously she is one of the most high profile coaches in college basketball, and the Gamecocks are very well known for their prowess. But those kinds of things, that kind of progression that Dawn Staley can make look so easy, and a credit to her players as well, because I think she recruits the right players for her mode of discipline and progression. But a player like Full Wiley playing so well in the second round of this tournament is not a guarantee. It took those steps. It took those steps at the beginning of the season. It took a player working very hard, and it took a coach identifying what a player needed to do better and not just getting kind of blown away by their talent. And I think that's a really good example of why South Carolina is set up to succeed. Of course, you can get into the X's and O's of it, the inside, the outside, the height, the depth, the three-point shooting that they didn't even necessarily have last year. But if you want to look at one player's progression, I think that's a really good example of why South Carolina is still the team to beat. And that game against UNC, they were up by 40 at one point. It's not close. It's not close right now. Now, obviously, things are about to get more difficult, but I just don't see South Carolina stumbling anytime soon. Other teams that really impressed me, other number one teams specifically, Texas and USC, both looked really good for the first two rounds. Texas is a dark horse here. I really think, and I'm saying this to myself in addition to all of you, Texas is not necessarily the flashiest team in the NCAA tournament. They really rely on their defense, but their defense is stifling. They're going to be a tough out for every single team that plays them. And they do get enough on the other end to put games away. So if your favorite team, if you've got a team still in the tournament and they've got Texas coming up, watch out because they're going to be in for a battle. And the Longhorns have that established set foundation that could carry them all the way to the Final Four. I have to say, it was really cool to see their first two games in this tournament. I think they have further to go maybe than even I thought that they did last week or a couple weeks ago. USC also looked really impressive. Juju Watkins is clearly feeling better. She was on something of a bum ankle, if not two, at the end of the Pac-12 tournament. She looks good to go. She had a fantastic game against Kansas in the second round. They look a little green at this stage. They've had like weird ticky-tack fouls. There was one progression in that second round game against Kansas where they picked up 3 fouls in probably 30 seconds to put Kansas in the bonus. Those little things they still need to clean up. USC as a number one seed does look a little bit inexperienced, but that's to be expected. And they pulled through it. They didn't get too down about it. They didn't hang their heads. They didn't let Kansas really go on a run. So good vibes in SoCal for USC. I also really like what I've seen from Notre Dame and from UConn. I mentioned last week that Notre Dame and UConn sort of have this push-pull where they're very talented. Their starting five ranks up there with some of the best, but they just don't have the depth because of injury that some of these other teams do. And the nice thing to see in these first two rounds was we saw the first part of that statement and not the second. So we got to see how these starting lineups, if you say like Paige Beckers, Aaliyah Edwards, Nika Mule, they had some fantastic freshmen step up. KK Arnold and Ashlyn Shade in the second round. Actually, in the first and second round, Ashlyn Shade has had a really nice breakout tournament as a freshman for UConn. They're playing really well. They are flowing well. If you think that Paige Beckers also can't add more elements to her game, you are sadly mistaken. She has clearly upped her defensive intensity. She is using her length a lot more. She had steals. She had a block in their second round game against Syracuse. She is also someone who is turning defense into offense, and her shot is so smooth when she's on. Their offense flows so smoothly. However, Nika Mule fouls out in the fourth quarter of this game, and suddenly Syracuse makes a run, and you're reminded, like, right, this is what can happen to UConn too. If they lose a single player to foul trouble or to injury mid-game, the whole landscape of the game changes for them. So they're still if plan A is working, very, very hard to beat. But I do think that part of the scouting report against UConn is going to be, okay, how can we get some of their more tenacious defenders in foul trouble and work this game to our favor? Similarly, Notre Dame, another team riddled with injury, but they are playing so well. They have not had any trouble over their first two rounds. They've looked confident. They look experienced. I think this was their third straight Sweet 16 run, but same issue, which is just if you can shut some of those starters down, what happens after that? But I would love to see Notre Dame make a little bit of a run here. They have a really tough Sweet 16 matchup going against Oregon State. But I must say that I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to see from the Irish in this tournament, and they've shown me shown me more than maybe I thought I would see. They've ridden that momentum from the ACC tournament into this part of the postseason, and they will go as far as that starting five takes them. Now, so those are my positives. Those are my compliments. Those are my teams that I like, that I feel like are looking really good, that I think like, okay, we're talking chalk. I think these people can hit chalk at Sweet 16, moving into some of these bigger Elite 8 matchups or even possibly the Final Four. Now, there are some other teams looking kind of tight. Some teams looking a little nervous, looking a little bit off their game. Like the mental element is getting to them a little bit, not handling upset bids well, focusing on the refs, focusing on the crowd. So let's hit on some of these teams that had just looked a little bit nervous in the first two rounds. I think the first team we have to talk about is Iowa, who couldn't separate themselves from West Virginia in the second round. They were outshot from the arc. They had a lot of turnovers. So the Mountaineers got a number of points off of turnovers against Iowa. We've seen Caitlin Clark in these first two rounds be very effusive with the referees, be very effusive with her teammates, playing to the crowd, kind of almost feeling like she's tipping a little bit too far into focusing on all the things other than just sort of playing her game. Not that she had like a bad game. I think she scored 32 points in the second round overall, but that question of when a player of that stature meets this moment where you know that this is it no matter what. For example, look at Iowa playing their last home game this weekend. No matter what, this is the last home game, right? There's no next time. There's no, we're going to give it our all, and if it doesn't go our way, I think that there is an element of pressure to that. So I am hopeful that we're going to see Iowa's best once they actually move away from home court advantage, though the crowd did help them a lot in the second round. But that question remains of how does Iowa make it through this really tricky Albany 2 region? They've got another really hard matchup against Colorado coming up in the Sweet 16. I think you can look at some of these two Pac-12 teams. Stanford and UCLA both looked a little tight in the second round. Stanford had to go into overtime to make it past Iowa State. Shout out to Audie Crooks, who I think is the breakout star of the first two rounds. Iowa State freshman, scores 40 points as a freshman in her first ever NCAA tournament game. Incredible stuff. Really, really enjoyed her work. UCLA had to come back from behind against Creighton in the second round too. They got outshot from behind the arc early on. They didn't panic. They kind of whittled away at the score very diligently, but it was a grind. And I think with UCLA, if they get stuck sort of on the defensive like that, it makes games tricky. And so I still like UCLA in their matchup coming up against LSU, and we'll get to LSU in a second. But it didn't come as easy as I thought maybe it would. But also, that's the double-edged sword of the first two rounds. Caitlin Clark actually said this after that game against West Virginia, where Iowa did not look as dominant, perhaps, as people expected them to. And she said, you know what? The second round is hard. Iowa lost in the second round 2 years ago. It's hard to go in favored. It's hard to go in when everyone just kind of expects you to win. We've seen athletes talk about this before, about the mentality of just holding people's expectations close to you can be difficult. You're doing it at home. A loss would not only be disappointing, it would be probably vaguely embarrassing for them. I think those things do get to players, and I think they especially pop up in the college game when players are so young. I think there's also something probably to be said, like I said, about the largeness of the moment here for some of these players, especially a player like Caitlin Clark, like Cameron Brink, who these players are moving on to the WNBA after this is over. There's no next time. And they're very high profile. There are a lot of people who have access to them through social media. These games all have implications for their branding and their personal brand and probably finances. And I think that can be a lot. That can be a toll on a player for sure. Other players who have looked a little in their own head are the LSU Tigers. And I got to tell you guys, I feel like it's something new every week with LSU. I've always got to have my little LSU segment because there's something going on with the LSU Tigers. The reigning champions have not really looked themselves over the first two rounds. A rough game against Rice at the beginning of the tournament. And then again, just not looking that great against Middle Tennessee through the first half, at least. Second half was a different story. But we have to talk about the big story that's surrounding LSU right now, and it's not on the court. It is off. Before the team's second round game, head coach Kim Mulkey goes out for her pregame press conference. I think it was her game day one press conference, and she gives a 4-minute public statement, which is preemptively refuting a piece of investigative journalism in the Washington Post. Now, this had come to light publicly because a different reporter had tweeted that they had heard that there was something in the works, but Mulkey is the person who brought this into the spotlight by addressing it on record. She did confirm that there is a story being at least worked on by a reporter in the Washington Post. And she was very aggressive in deflection tactics with this. A lot of tried and true deflection here. She said that the reporter was reaching out to disgruntled former players and ignoring positive stories, and saying that the reporter was tracking people down and bribing them with anonymity if they were going to say negative things about her. And then she closed by threatening legal action using the word defamation. I mean, we've seen this before with public figures who feel like there might be something not particularly flattering coming through in investigative journalism. My one piece on that, obviously, is I myself have done a little bit of investigative journalism in my past, and I will say that I have all the faith in the world that the Washington Post has done their due diligence, not only in the legality of everything that they have written. I'm sure they've gone through extensive legal review, but I'm sure they've also given Mulkey and other named parties ample time to respond. I do not believe that the Washington Post, if there's any malfeasance here, I think that they know what they're doing, and whatever reporting they release not only is something that I think we should take seriously, but also clearly has Mulkey concerned, because she, like I said, is the one who brought this into the spotlight, while also simultaneously saying it wasn't going to be a distraction to her team, which I think at this point is obviously not true. Players are being asked about it in the locker room. They're being asked about her. We saw Angel Reese basically decline to comment. We've seen other players give more basic comments of positivity towards their coach. This became something that was put in front of the media before the piece came out, like I said, primarily by Mulkey, by making this statement. And so it's hard to say what this is going to mean for them mentally going forward. It's hard to say if this had an impact on their performance on the court. I think some of their issues, at least in that Middle Tennessee game, were a little bit more mundane than feeling like they were distracted completely or off their game. It was actually just a little bit timid, to be honest, in the first half against Middle Tennessee, and I think they tightened up a lot in the second half and looked great. So LSU put their best half of basketball together in the second half of the second round, and it'll be really fascinating to see if everything that's happening off the court is going to impact these players, because there was talk on ESPN about it kind of being galvanizing, and I don't know if I think that is either happening or probably good for them. I don't think you want the highs to get too high. I don't think you want the lows to get too low. I don't think you want to walk in frustrated or with a chip on your shoulder. I think that is not always useful, especially when there's something happening that has to do with your coach and you have to focus on you. So I don't know. LSU is tricky. It's been a little bit disappointing from them so far on the court, and I think that everyone is just looking forward to seeing what exactly this report brings, because I'm sure there's some really important journalism in there. But kind of classic Kim Mulkey style, she deflected the possibility that she was culpable for this being a distraction, while also perhaps making it a bigger one. Moving into the Sweet 16, the next time we have our little chat here, we will be through the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8. Like I said, a lot of chalk to talk about in this first segment, not a ton of upsets. I don't mind that overall. I think we would like to see some of these truly blockbuster matchups later in these rounds. And if teams aren't going to look convincing, I think we want to see them tested against other blockbuster Power 5 teams, as much as I love the underdog. So what will the Sweet 16 bring? Excited for some of these matchups. Obviously, LSU versus UCLA. I'm going to stick with my pick here. I like UCLA in this matchup, not necessarily because I think both teams are playing incredibly well, but just because if it does turn into something of a grind, I think UCLA is better set up to withstand that than LSU is. They have a little bit more depth. If it's a very tightly whistled game, I think that works in UCLA's favor. If it's not a very tightly whistled game, I think that also works in UCLA's favor. So that, in addition to, God knows what more news we're going to hear about LSU later this week, I like the Bruins in this one still. Iowa versus Colorado, I don't know. This could be an upset watch. I don't, not necessarily because I think that Iowa cannot take down Colorado, but if it's that same Iowa that we saw in the second round, and it's kind of that same Colorado that we've seen in the first two rounds where they've been confident, and they've looked good, and they're from a great conference, I don't know. This could be an upset watch here. I think Iowa's road to the Final Four gets really tricky from here on out. Less confident in Stanford than I was last week. I think that overtime win over Iowa State, I think, probably took a lot out of them and just showcased, again, just sort of the scouting report against Stanford, I think gets a little bit too easy if you can take Cameron Brink out of the game. I think NC State has a good shot there. I'm going to go with USC over Baylor, UConn over Duke, Texas over Gonzaga. I'm going to go with South Carolina over Indiana. Like I said, I've got South Carolina winning this whole thing. I still think they're the team to beat. And I'm going to say my one final tiny upset, maybe Oregon State over Notre Dame. I know I'm very still high on the Pac-12, but Notre Dame has looked really, really good. Oregon State, I just think, we're moving into the stage of the tournament where Oregon State has the rotations to be able to beat a team like Notre Dame. But we'll see. No matter what, I'm very excited. Can't wait to see some of these matchups. It's going to be a really, really good next 2 weeks. It could be all number 1 seeds in the Final Four. It could be half that. I have no idea actually how this is going to go down, but I can't wait to see things reset in Portland and in Albany next week. All right, moving on to soccer. We have some let's say some breaking news for you. We have a new U.S. women's national team roster drop. This is the group that will be brought in for the 2-game April SheBelieves Cup series, 1 game against Japan, and then a second game against either Canada or Brazil, who obviously you might remember from less than a month ago in the CONCACAF Gold Cup. The way the Gold Cup sort of extended into March makes this a really quick turnaround. These are 2 international periods back to back. A lot of exciting stuff going on in this roster, though. It's not super surprising that we're seeing some change from the Gold Cup, not least because I think there are some injuries being dealt with here, though they were not confirmed in the release. We're seeing multiple new players get brought in. This is moving into real Emma Hayes territory. These are the last 2 games before Hayes takes over, and I think you're starting to see her hand on this roster more and more. So let's read the list, and then we'll get into it. So goalkeepers, Jane Campbell, Casey Murphy, Alyssa Nair. Standard, same as always. I think they're getting into a pretty tight rotation there. Defenders, Abby Dahlkemper, Crystal Dunn, Tierna Davidson, Emily Fox, Eva Gaetino, Naomi Girma, Casey Kruger, and Jenna Neiswanger. Midfielders, Corbin Albert, Sam Coffey, Lindsay Horan, Olivia Moultrie, Emily Sonnet, and Lily Johannes. And our forwards are Katarina Macario, Alex Morgan, Trinity Rodman, Jaden Shaw, Sophia Smith, and Mallory Swanson. So, I love to say it. There's a lot of things going on here, but that's good. We want that. Like I said, by far the most Emma Hayes-esque roster we've seen thus far, pulling in every American that played in the Champions League last week. We're seeing Champions League play rewarded. A little bit more Eurocentric, which I think no one is shocked about based on not only bringing a Hayes in, but also some of her public comments surrounding last year's World Cup. I think she would like to see more diversity in experience in the United States roster. But this is Hayes also doing 2 separate things, which I think we saw Vlatko do about 4 years ago, which is that they're putting together an Olympic roster, but they're also trying to set the stage for the new era of the team. And so there is some talent identification going on here that is definitely everyone has a legitimate shot at the Olympic roster, but also there need to be communication lines established for a player that maybe doesn't make the Olympic roster so they do not feel like they are being forgotten. But let's start with the main headline here. Katarina Macario and Mal Swanson are back. Both have played minutes in their returns for their clubs. Macario has been on more limited minutes, coming in late in games for Chelsea FC, but she's been incredibly efficient in that time. I think it's 3 goal contributions in 4 appearances now. Maybe 5 over the weekend. I don't remember, but she's looked really, really sharp, though she hasn't played very much. Consecutive minutes, I guess I should say. Swanson a little bit in the opposite, where she has been building minutes actually really nicely. She's playing about 60 minutes. She's played about 60 minutes in 2 games for the Chicago Red Stars thus far. She's yet to hit the back of the net, but it's clear that she's working on kind of building the comfort level after being out for a full year, and the goals will come. No one is really expecting her to be at her sharpest just yet. Her club coach, Lauren Donaldson, actually said this week that he's expecting that to happen in maybe about a month or so. But she's looking healthy. She's looking fit. She's looking like she's getting her pace back. Really nice to see those players back. Those are players that I think to this day, it's a little bit underrated just how much they were missed at the World Cup. You definitely say next player up with a team with the depth like the U.S. has, but those 2 are incredible. And you just kind of look at that list and you go, yes, we're getting closer. The team is getting closer to perhaps what they would like that lineup to look like for the forwards in the Olympics. I think obviously 2 really notable things are the Gaetino and Johannes first senior call-ups, both play in the Champions League. Gaetino previously played for Notre Dame. She went over to PSG, which I think they're rewarding that as well. I think that's an ambitious move for a young player. She scored a goal for PSG in the Champions League last week. On the upswing, she's a defender, which is also, I think, useful for the U.S. as they sort of figure out those lineups after having some questions in the defense in the Gold Cup. And then Johannes is also a huge storyline. She's only 16. She's lived in the Netherlands since she was 10, and she plays for Ajax in the Netherlands. Really technical footballer, wonderful midfielder, really talented player. She is absolutely going to be a player that plays internationally at the international level. The greater question was for who. She is an American citizen. She was born in Virginia. She is not yet a Dutch citizen. That would take a little bit longer to go through, I think, the naturalization process there. But the head coach of the Netherlands women's national team has asserted that she is at least interested in representing the Netherlands, which is the country that she lives in, and one that she has lived in culturally for a number of years. Though obviously a manager like Hayes is going to want to bring her back in with the US to make sure that she's sure about that decision. Hayes had some really good things to say about Johannes because they actually played Chelsea in the Champions League last week. She was not speaking directly about recruiting her for the national team, but just sort of generally talked about how much she rates her. And I think she also just had a really good statement about Johannes is going to make the right decision for her. Her getting called into this camp is not a finalized decision either way, but I like that she's weighing her options, and I like that the US is pushing for this because this is a really talented player, and you don't want to fall into a habit of saying, oh, well, we have really talented players playing in the United States, so we shouldn't pursue these other nationals that are playing abroad. And I think actually that's one of the great things about this new Emma Hayes era is that she is going to do that. She's going to push for, again, more diversity of experience. She's going to try to scout outside of usual or more traditional US scouting, which is usually through college or NWSL or the US youth national teams, though Johannes has experience there as well. It's the kind of swing you have to make to stay relevant on the global stage. And whether Johannes decides that she would like to play for the US or whether she would like to play for the Netherlands, which again is 100% her choice and where she will feel most comfortable, it's good that the program is pursuing this because she is a fantastic player. Some of the notable absences, we saw, unfortunately, Midge Purce suffer an injury against Portland this weekend. The release for the roster drop did not say in either way whether any absences were actually injury related, but I think maybe you can construe that injury influenced Purce's absence, also influenced the absence of Rose Lavelle and Lynn Williams, who still have not played for Gotham yet in 2 matches, coming back from the Gold Cup with light knocks. Again, not confirmed, but just a possibility, I think, kind of reading between the lines. A player who did play in the NWSL this week who was not called in was Becky Sauerbrunn. Very difficult at this moment to kind of tell where she stacks with this team. She had a rough performance against Mexico. She's still an incredibly important leader for them, obviously. They're trying to figure out what the center back rotation needs to be while feeling probably pretty good about the starting 2 of Davidson and Girma right now. Dahlkemper, who also had a rough game against Mexico, does get called in. Hard to see exactly where the logic is going with this, but I do think Sauerbrunn's absence is notable. But I think the injuries in the other position spots, the injuries in the forward line and in the midfield kind of worked out for the numbers, where I'm not sure anything else there are really snubs. Just not enough NWSL time either for any of these other players to work their way probably back into form. And then I also just like that there's not that much handholding in terms of veteran leadership with this group. And that is something that is earned by the Gold Cup experience. I think if they had not had the Gold Cup, which there are downsides to the Gold Cup and what it did for players' fitness in preseason and how it took them away from their club teams, and probably not necessarily the best timing for overall development during the course of the year. But it does mean that these games, there doesn't need to be a lot of veteran handholding. There doesn't need to be one known 2015 or 2019 World Cup winner on each line, though they do have that because that's a large portion of the team. I think you go through that experience and you grow from it. And they went through some really tough games in that tournament. And suddenly you go, no, well, I'm the veteran, at least right now. I just went through this Gold Cup. We're putting this group back together. We're bringing in a couple new players who are going to integrate into this tight-knit group that we've developed over that experience in February and in March. And I think it sets them up well. I mean, I said this the last time we talked about Gold Cup. I think it's going to pay huge dividends for that team so long as it does not affect their fitness long term. Things I like a little bit less about this roster. This is just quick hits, obviously, and I'm excited to see the games, but I'm still not entirely sure what the plan is for the defensive midfield, other than kind of hoping that Sam Coffey continues to progress and Emily Sonnet is still a good option there. And there hasn't really been enough time in the NWSL for perhaps a player like Andy Sullivan to work herself back into the conversation. This gets more into formation and tactics necessarily than just personnel, but that it's a part of the field that the U.S. has still not solved. I think we still saw that in the Gold Cup in spaces, and I'm not sure that this necessarily addresses that. I think that the U.S. is really interested in very creative on the ball attacking midfielders, playmakers. How do they spring attacks? How do they move the ball well? How do they possess? But they're not necessarily focusing as much on who's going to win the ball. Are they going to play, two defensive midfielders? Are they going to play one? Do they have the personnel for one? I think with Coffee and Sonnet, you say, okay, maybe against some teams, not against other teams. Why are you bringing in all of these great attacking midfielders if you are going to have to play that double pivot with the two defensive midfielders because you're not necessarily as confident in personnel as a lone number 6? I think that those are the questions that we're going to see more going into these games. And then the center back depth is still a question, I think, as well. Davidson and Gurma, clear first choice. Dahlkemper, a good fit, simply maybe by way of working with Gurma at their club team. Gaetino is a little bit of a wild card. I'm excited to see what she can do. I hope she gets some minutes. Sometimes those work, sometimes those don't. But like I said, there's two things happening here, which is that there's experimentation happening to get ready for the Olympics, but there's also this tending to the health of the player pool that's happening. And that was something that Vlatko Andonovski, I think, started out really strong at when in the early days of his tenure with the U.S. And then I think it got maybe worse and worse as the pressure of results started following him a little bit more. Some of those early days with Vlatko, he brought in Alana Cook, who was in danger of being poached by the English national team. He started working in some of these players like Macario, like Smith, like Trinity Rodman, just getting younger players in the player pool, working players through. Well, and also a lot of that happened post-Olympics because, like I said, that marriage of results and process has never been an easy one for the United States women's national team. But I like that this is happening before the Olympics. I hope that Hayes is empowered to be brave when she actually makes the Olympic call, because as we saw last time, there was, I think, a little bit of being timid in actually getting players experience at a major tournament, while understanding that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win it. But also, I don't know, sometimes your best players are your greenest ones. And the U.S. has taken that approach in the past too. So I'm excited to see this group play. I hope, as always, that that the approach to the formation, the approach to the personnel that they put out on the pitch sets them up to succeed. And I hope that SheBelieves remains productive, because this is the last one before Hayes comes in, and then it's truly crunch time. And then finally, turning our attention to the NWSL, which had another full slate of matches this weekend. Like I said, it was a women's sports utopia in the United States, had many screens going, got snacks, hung out on the couch, watched a lot of sports. So 2 weekends in, most of the league have played 2 games. 2 teams have only played 1 due to the Challenge Cup. And we're seeing some, I think, exciting trends. Hopefully, like I said at the top of the show, not going to get too granular, can't go game by game, but some cool stuff already. Some cool stuff already happening in the NWSL. I think the main one that came out of the weekend, if we're looking at the standings, is that Chicago and Kansas City are at the top of the table after finishing 2023 in the bottom. The Red Stars are the first team in NWSL history to win their first 2 matches after finishing the previous season in last place. Really impressive, even if it's just sort of vibes, tenacity, and a little bit of luck. On the flip side, San Diego and Portland are in the bottom this week. Surprising turn for perennial contenders, raising eyebrows a little bit, though obviously for San Diego, that's simply 1 loss. But for Portland, it is 2. And we'll kind of get into what that means in a second. So not going to get into games too much. It's been enough days have passed. I'm just going to kind of put this into tiers, I think. Not necessarily power rankings, because those stress me out sometimes, but more just what is the vibe coming out of some of these games. So I'm going to start with and I've named these myself. These are my personal tiers for this week. In the soccer is a funny sport tier, I'm putting North Carolina and Louisville. Both of these teams did not win their games this weekend, but they probably should have. North Carolina actually lost to Utah, and Louisville drew Houston. But if you're looking at the underlying stats, if you're looking at the chances created, if you're looking at, North Carolina had 2 penalties, one of which they missed and the other which got saved. These teams should have won. It's the kind of games that you walk away from and you go, not happy necessarily with the result, but I'm happy with the process. If you're the coaches, North Carolina should stick to the game plan. They have actually overrun their opponents in 2 straight games. I think they just got a little bit unlucky, and I'll get to what Utah did there in a second, but both head coaches for these teams should feel pretty good. Stay the course despite dropping points. The NWSL is a funny league. Sometimes the ball doesn't bounce your way. So don't get too shocked if you're looking at the results for these 2 teams. This one is you did everything you possibly could. You executed the game plan and didn't go your way this time. My next tier is the we know how to play NWSL ball tier. I'm going to go with Chicago, Utah, and Kansas City. 3 winners this weekend. All teams won fairly against the run of play, fairly against possession stats. None of these teams necessarily held the ball a ton. especially Chicago and Utah, I think, to highlight. You don't always need the technique to play the most beautiful form of soccer to get the results that you need. And I think especially we like I said before, with Chicago and with Kansas City, there are things that need to be addressed that go sort of beyond just the X's and O's. Some of it was just, I think, Chicago talks about needing to kind of change the team culture. Kansas City is trying to implement a better defense, and it works sometimes and it doesn't work sometimes, and they're working on it. They don't hold the ball as well without Dabinia, who is dealing with a hamstring injury. She will be back a little bit later in April. But yeah, if you just look at the mental side of the game, the ability to play without the ball, the ability to do last-ditch defending, holding a lead, I think all three of these teams did that really well, and they're going to want to improve. I think that if I say on the flip side that North Carolina and Louisville should feel fine, I think that these teams should feel good about the results and also like they have a lot of work to do. Chicago in particular did not do a great job of holding onto the ball at the end of the game, and they got lucky is maybe the wrong word, but they kind of put themselves in the position to have to do a lot of defending. I think I said this last week, as many times you're going to concede as many as you save in that regard. So they're going to work on control. They're going to work on technique. They still have some gaps in the midfield that they need to figure out. But Chicago, Utah, Kansas City, very good NWSL ball clubs, and no one's going to want to play them. And I think the number one thing you can do in the NWSL, if you're still figuring out asserting your own style of play, is simply to make yourself very difficult to play against. And these clubs should feel good about that. And like I said, for teams like Chicago and Kansas City, what a breath of fresh air to feel like you're on the side of the good for once, and you get to work these things out from a winning position as opposed to feeling like you're falling into a hole. There's kind of this middle-ish tier, the figuring it out tier. I'm going to put a bunch of teams in here: Gotham, Washington, Orlando, Angel City, Bay FC. We're seeing some interesting progression. Gotham played a risky high line with that new look defense against Portland, which worked, but it was close. They had Portland had 2 goals called for offside. Sophia Smith really could have gotten one in that game. They kind of score against the run of play. They get away with a 1-0 win. Washington takes all 3 points at the death with goals from 2 rookies. This is, I think, a good indicator of how they're dealing with their rebuild, which is that it's not always going to be perfect, especially right now, but they think that the upside of some of these younger players is totally worth it. And I think we saw the benefits of that. We're seeing the players that they sent out, like Sam Staub in Chicago and Ashley Sanchez, play really well for other clubs. And you think to yourself, oh my gosh, how could they send these players out? And then you see the rookies play and you go, oh, well, those rookies are also very good. So I think Washington got a good point of emphasis on their internal logic for this season. Orlando and Angel City played to a stalemate. Both teams playing very open, very committed to their style of play, to end-to-end kind of soccer, willing to take risks in both attacking and defensive areas. I think both of these teams are going to be able to score goals this season. Orlando is still waiting on their star striker, Barbara Banda, I think due to just sort of getting the visa issues figured out. But the question is control. I don't know if these teams necessarily have the ability to control games just yet. That comes down to the midfield and the possession from the back line. So those 2 teams are actually going to be really exciting to watch, but I think they would like to control the game a little bit more. And then Bay FC, I think, just learned a valuable lesson about not mentally switching off. This was, I think, a growing experience for them. I still think Asisa Oshuala is the best new signing in the league. I think they're going to be fine. I think they are certainly a work in progress in just their second ever game as a club. But yeah, a valuable lesson for them learned this weekend. My I'm not worried, but I'm a little worried tier is the Reign, Portland, and San Diego. Maybe San Diego and the Reign don't deserve to be there. It's hard to say. They have clear arguments for being in that sort of soccer is a funny sport tier, but there are maybe just more underlying issues for them that they are probably going to need to address to avoid results like these in the future. The Reign outpossessed Chicago. They just could not turn that dangerous movement into clear-cut shots on goal. Jisoo Yun had an incredible goal this week, but that was a shot from distance. It's just too typical for what we've seen from the Reign. It was a little bit similar to what we saw last week. Last week they get the win. This week they don't. I'm curious to see if they can kind of break out of that rut and go on more of a run to turn some of their possession into goals. San Diego had the better run of play against Kansas City. They are also, I think they can make a fair argument that many of their players' involvement in the Gold Cup put them at a fitness disadvantage going into the early part of the season, but they still just have big midfield questions. They did not invest a ton in their midfield in the offseason, and I think that is, again, it's hard to control games when you don't have the middle of the pitch in your favor in that respect. It turns things into you have to move the ball quicker. You have to, and Naomi Girma and the way that she can progress the ball, and so can Abby Dahlkemper, does help a lot. But it just feels like there's that missing piece for San Diego that would make them even more dominant than they already are. And then with Portland, it's a little bit more obvious. They're 0 for 2. They've lost 2 games in their first 2 matches. The midfield didn't look super connected again. Sophia Smith is doing a lot of work on her own. The defense kind of fell asleep on that goal against the run of play from Gotham. things are just not quite clicking. I think that's on the coaching staff and the general manager. I think that they had some players leave and they had some players come in, and it's just not clicking yet. And you just kind of have to wait and see if it starts to. But I understand why Portland fans might be a little bit impatient with this project and feel like it's not necessarily clear how the Thorns have improved from last year, and also wishing for a little bit of a heavier tactical hand from the coaching staff, because I think last year Mike Norris found a lot of success by letting the team play like they had in their championship winning season. And this is not the same team. So you want to see more from your coach in that respect. You had the one really steady season where you let the team play. But what happens when you have to assert actually your own philosophies and tactics into the game? And then I have one, it's a dubious tier, the I'm worried tier. And that goes to the Houston Dash. All of last week's caveats apply. Brand new coach, early days, figuring out a new system. They're still giving up a lot in the defense. Shout out to Jane Campbell for a ridiculous performance this weekend to give the team a point. They're not making much in the attack. There are so many things that they need to adjust. Now, I don't know, maybe you shift the formation, you make the balance a little bit different, you give a little bit more help in the defensive midfield. When you have questions in the defense and questions in the offense where you're giving up a lot of goals and you're also not really shifting that by making the tempo push or getting more shots of your own, I am always in the inclination that you should focus on the defense first and then build from there, but they have a number of season-ending absences. I don't know what's going to happen with the Dash. I think you can't expect Jane Campbell to stand on her head every single game, and it's going to be kind of a brutal learning curve. What can happen? I mean, I've had people say to me before that the NWSL is a little bit more of a slow game than you might think, and I do think that's true. You cannot win or lose the league in probably the first 5 to 8 weeks, which can feel like a long time for fans, but trust me, the season is long this year. But you can start to compound the underlying issues that are causing you to struggle with results. And I think for the Dash, the danger that they're in is if you're working through a system that is clearly outmatched, how long do you develop in that system to try to make it improve? Or how nimble can you be to make changes to, again, just try to make yourself a little bit more of a tougher outing rather than feeling like you're giving up too much space in the back for an attacking system that is not working. So that was a lot to cover this week. Excited for next week. We're going to get into Sweet 16 and the Elite 8. We're going to have more NWSL to talk about. We will have more U.S. Women's National Team in the future to discuss. I think we're also probably going to see some interesting player decisions in terms of the offseason for NCAA women's basketball, whether it's transferring or going to the WNBA. I can't wait to see how all these players progress. My final thought is I do want to give a couple shout outs to some players leaving college basketball. First, I want to shout out Daisha Fair, who ended her college career with Syracuse this weekend, third in the all-time NCAA women's basketball scoring list. Incredible career for her. Wow, this season has completely reshaped the way we think about scoring in women's basketball. It's really cool. I also want to give a shout out to Rickea Jackson, who ended her college career with Tennessee this weekend. It was an immense performance for the Volunteers in that second round game that just wasn't quite enough of a full team performance to get over the top, but she's going to be a fantastic pro someday. I know it's hard to move on, but I'm excited to see what these players do in the future. And this has been The Late Sub. Shout out to producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton. I am your host, Claire Watkins, and we will see you next week.